Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Ginger Fay, and I'm the Global Director of Partnerships here at Applerouth Education. We are thrilled that you could join us tonight, where we are going to take a deep dive into the high school admissions process in New York City specifically, which has its own special way of doing things and a whole alphabet soup of standardized testing that students might need to participate in. And that's a lot to figure out. And so we've invited tonight two fantastic experts to walk us through it. Maurice Frumkin, who leads an organization called NYC Admission Solutions. Maurice has terrific experience on the school side of this and now shares that information with students and parents when they're going through the application process. And Applerouth's own Matt Kiesner, who is our absolute sort of resident expert on all high school going students and their testing processes. So Maurice and Matt, thank you both so much for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. For those of you who don't know Applerouth, we are an education company. We work with students to help them build their confidence and their skills. We find if you can change a student's self-belief, then you can change their life because they can then do what they're capable of. And it is incredibly exciting for us to be able to be part of that journey with students. And if we can be of help to you, we would be honored and delighted. We help students in 3 different ways. We do academic tutoring. We work with students anywhere from early, middle, elementary through college. We help students with high stakes standardized testing, whether they're entering a high school, college, or grad school program. And we also work with students on executive function skills to try and sort of put it all together. So if we can be of help to you, I hope you'll invite us to be part of your journey. Tonight, we are going to talk with Maurice and Matt, as I mentioned. Maurice is the president and founder of NYC Admission Solutions, and he has worked at the New York Department of Education as an admissions official. He was an admissions director at an independent school. He has counseled hundreds of families through this process in New York City. He knows it all, and so we're grateful to have his expertise with us tonight. As I mentioned, Matt Kiesner is one of our premium tutors. He's actually, he really is the most requested tutor, but I don't always say that in front of any other tutors. He has been our training manager and curriculum creator, and he has worked with students on all of the tests that we're going to talk about tonight, and there are a lot of them. So thank you both for being here. We are going to try and do a quick poll to start this. We'd like to know a little bit about our audience. So we'd love to know, are you a student or a parent or an educator who's trying to learn more about this process? Where is the student that you're working with in this process? And what kinds of schools are you considering? So if you could take a quick minute to answer the poll, I would appreciate it. And then most of tonight is really to try and answer your questions. So that's our one set of questions for you. The rest of those the questions tonight are yours, and Maurice and Matt will do their best to answer them in the next hour. So if you have questions along the way, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box, and we will cover as many of the topics as we can before we wrap up tonight. So feel free to put those questions in the Q&A box as they occur to you, and we will have some dedicated time at the end of the presentation to talk about those in particular. Tonight, basically, we're going to kind of do a series of case studies. We're going to talk about different circumstances and scenarios that families in New York might find themselves in when they're entering and embarking on this process of applying to selective high schools. And with each of those case studies comes the ABCs of testing. What kind of standardized tests might be recommended or required based on the kinds of schools the student is considering. So we're going to have, Maurice is going to kind of introduce us to the students and the application process that they'll be going through, and Matt is going to detail what they need to know about the standardized tests. So that's our plan for tonight. So we're going to let you, Maurice, kind of get us introduced to SHSAT Sam, our first student, our first case study scenario, and we'll dive right in. And I will look forward to moderating questions as they come in at the end of our talk. Thanks.
Thank you, Ginger and Matt. It's such an honor to be here with Applerouth tonight, and I'm going to do the best that I can to sort of frame the conversation and contextualize in the with respect to the admissions process, but I think you'll all be really anxious to hear from Matt with respect to each of the individual tests. So we're going to look at, as Ginger alluded to, we're going to look at some case studies to give you some perspective on what some common families do, especially in New York City, and how that relates to testing in particular. And I think one thing that Ginger mentioned that really resonates with me this time of year, as rising 8th grade families or current 7th grade families are starting to get a sense of fit and what schools make sense for them, and start to develop and build that preliminary list of schools. When you're in that process, you start to get a little bit more clarity on what those schools require, and thus the testing that the schools that you might be looking at require. So I think the timing of this conversation is really good. And again, we're going to give you some case studies. The first case study that I want to start with is a family that is looking at the infamous specialized high schools in New York City. And what you see on the screen in front of you, this student by the name of Sam is interested in one or more of the 8, what the DOE calls the specialized testing schools. And I just clarify that only because there are technically 9 specialized high schools, including LaGuardia High School, but only the 8 at the top of the screen actually require the test called the SHSAT that Matt is going to be talking a lot about. So if you're a student or a family that's thinking about one or more of the 8 schools that you see on the screen in front of you, just know that those schools, this has not changed. The only way to be considered for those 1 or up to 8 schools is by taking the SHSAT. Slide, please. So what happens this time of year, what's very common, if you haven't already decided that these schools might be for you, the specialized high schools are for you, is I think it's really good to start to do some preliminary research, and there are a lot of different ways to do that. And of course, considering what test prep plan might make sense for you and your child. But eventually what's going to happen is you will actually register for the test in the fall of 8th grade. So whether or not you're currently in an independent middle school, a private middle school, parochial, public, whatever the case may be, as long as you're an 8th grade student who lives in New York City or a first-time 9th grade student who lives in New York City, you're eligible to take this test once in 8th grade. And in the fall of 8th grade, what's going to happen, or 9th grade as the case may be, but in the fall, you will get access to this My School system, which is basically the DOE application system. And one of the functions of the My School system is it's the vehicle through which you can register for the SHSAT. So in the fall, you'll be able to register for the SHSAT. At the time of registration, what happens is you'll indicate up to the 8 schools that we showed on the previous slide that you're interested in. And that's really important because when you choose the specialized high schools that you're interested in, including their rank order, your preference order, that combined with the score on the test, of course, and the number of offers that are made to each of the specialized high schools, and that varies from year to year, those are the only criteria that determine eligibility for these 8 schools. So course marks from middle school, attendance from middle school, none of that other stuff matters. What matters is the schools you choose at the time of registration, because I could have the best score on the SHSAT in the entire city, but if I don't choose one of the SHSAT schools, if I don't choose Stuyvesant, for example, it doesn't matter what my score is. I have to choose the school. I put them in preference order, and then the rest is up to the DOE algorithm, which is a whole other conversation I won't get into tonight. So your score is obviously really, really important. Now, I also want to emphasize that regardless of how you do on the SHSAT, your performance on the test is completely independent from every other type of application for every other type of school. So if you take this test, it doesn't matter how you do when it comes to applying to non-specialized public schools, charter schools, parochial schools, private schools. Your performance on this test has no impact on any other type of application other than your application to the SHSAT schools. The other thing I just want to mention before we move on is that you can, as I think I mentioned, you can test once as an 8th grader and potentially once as a first-time 9th grader. what ends up happening is if you attend a public middle school, what happens is now, this is relatively new, is that most public middle school students take the test late October, early November, depending upon when the timeline, the official timeline the DOE releases later in this year. But most public middle school kids take the test at their home school. If you're a New York City resident and you attend an independent school, for example, most kids do not take it at their school. They take it on the weekend at a central DOE site that you'll learn about in the fall. Okay, I think I'll pass it along.
All right, sorry, I unmute myself. Excuse me. Yeah, so I was going to talk a little bit about the SHSAT as a test, because it is an interesting one, and as Maurice said, it is, you either get the score you need for the to admission to the school, or you don't. And so I think it's for those students that are and families that are looking for the interest in the specialized high schools, I mean, this is something that you obviously need to take pretty seriously. So it's a 3-hour test, and it's got an ELA section and a math section of equal weight. There is a little bit of mix of some kind of, or we call it revising editing questions, or they're based on grammar and are similar to how the SAT or ACT tests on like the quality of writing, like does the sentence make sense where it is, and so there's a little bit of that grammar, and then the rest of it's just going to be reading comprehension passages with a pretty good variety of passages. Some of them are going to include charts and tables and graphs and things like that. And then the math section is going to start off with what's called grid in, so that would be where a student produces the answer. So there'll be a blank, and you can put a decimal, you can put a fraction line, you also can put a negative on there. And the topics are going to be, kind of a wide variety of things that a 8th grader should be exposed to. You're certainly going to see some algebra, nothing really going into like beyond polynomial kind of stuff, but linear equations, function notation, that kind of thing. For geometry, it's going to be basic 2D, 3D geometry stuff, and then a fair amount of statistics and understanding mean, median, mode, range, and data interpolation from graphs and charts and stuff. As I'll say for all these slides, none of these allow a calculator. There's no way to get a calculator for this. And then I don't really want to talk about the scale per se for the SHSAT, because it's really kind of a moving target. Every year they kind of give people their scores, and they also have them in a like families will get together to try to build the scale and figure out the cutoff score. But then after all that information, they toss it out for the next year. And I think that it's really not, trying to hit it, like it's either you get in or you don't, right? Versus, trying to hit a target score. And so much so that like when we run mock tests for this, we just, this is your percentage correct. And what we want to do is move that percentage correct, because that's going to put you in better standing. But there's not really a good understanding of other scaled scores, and they don't offer percentiles. Next slide, please. So for a student like Sam, who's looking into the SHSAT, preparation is key for this test. There are practice tests available online from the homepage of the New York City Department of Education. And to get used to that timing of this, we'll also be offering a free practice test here May 6th that will be online proctored. And you also will get like the percentile, or sorry, percentage, and see what you got right and wrong, and also analytics of those. We'll say that oh, this is how you're doing in geometry versus algebra and those kind of things. One thing that's kind of weird about this test compared to a lot of the other standardized tests is that it is a 3-hour block where you are allowed to move however you like through that test. So if a student is more of a math student, I would suggest that they go to the math section first and get those points, and go through that, and then double back to the reading and the rest of the ELA section. But if for another student who is more of a reading student, then obviously, do it that way. That's pretty unusual to be able to kind of move throughout that. So, understanding how to navigate a 3-hour test and know that there are no breaks in it either. So anytime a student has to use the restroom or something, that there's also a good bit of loss of time. And I've had students who've tested tell me that it's like kind of that there's oftentimes a line for the bathroom, and then you have to be rechecked in to make sure that you hadn't grabbed notes or something. And so actually the idea of a quick bathroom break doesn't seem to be true in a lot of scenarios. The other things for the structure of there's going to be no formula help for math, and the reading passages. I think the level of reading does not really exceed 8th grade standards, but I do find that the way that they ask questions is quite tricky. Most of the questions are about understanding the purpose of writing and why did the author do this towards their goal. And it's not the kind of reading where like, what does this word mean, or what's the main idea of the passage. And I think it's fair to talk about test anxiety, because you have one opportunity to do this, and it's either you get the score that you need for the schools that you apply to, or you don't. And I think that that's a lot of pressure to put on an 8th grader. And that's a big pressure day. So trying to mitigate that and acknowledging that stress, but also make sure that your students feel supported. And I think one of the best things to do is to get that practice and to get that exposure to the test, so that there's less unknowns going into there, and to kind of think about what you have to do on that day, because I know that a lot of students find that this is as really as high stakes as any of these sort of testing gets, and it's important to kind of acknowledge that. Where for the other ones, you can take them multiple times, or your as we're going to talk about in a second, there are other aspects to your application.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Awesome. Next case study we're going to look at is a student named Annie, who is only applying to independent or private schools. Now, if you live in New York City, there are some schools, the term independent or private school is used pretty interchangeably, although there are many private schools that are not necessarily independent schools. So for example, most parochial schools are not technically referred to as independent schools, with a couple of exceptions. But suffice it to say that these are tuition-based schools. I would say that the parochial schools, the vast majority of parochial schools, are at significantly lower price points than traditional independent day schools in New York City. One of the other distinguishing characteristics about independent day schools in New York City is that you will rarely see schools that offer any kind of merit scholarship or merit aid, as opposed to Catholic schools and a lot of boarding schools around the country and around the world that consider that often will offer merit aid, as opposed to financial aid that's based on family need. So it's important to make note of the requirements, not only in terms of which schools offer what kind of aid, but also in terms of testing requirements. So there are some schools, particularly Catholic schools, that will require that you take a certain test called the HSPT, for example, in order to qualify for a scholarship. So it's really important if you find yourself at this time of year, especially as a rising 8th grade family, getting into the realm of tuition-based schools, to start taking a look at what testing is required by the school or not required. Because there are some schools that require testing, and they might give you a bunch of different options. They might say, okay, you can take this test or that test. And we're going to give you a couple of more tangible examples in a second. And there are some schools that are test optional. And what we're finding, particularly in the secular landscape of non-parochial independent schools in New York City, is that there are more and more schools that have gone test optional. And part of that is because of COVID, but for other reasons as well. You're going to see probably as you develop your list of schools for independent schools and as official application criteria are released by the end of the summer, which is usually when schools release their official requirements for the fall, you're going to see maybe a good number of schools that you're considering are in fact test optional. Now, one question that I just want to address from the get-go, because I get this question a lot, is about whether or not they really mean test optional when they say test optional. And the answer is yes. When they say test optional, they really mean it. They understand that students, for a wide variety of reasons, may not be taking a test, and you're not penalized if you do not take the test. Now, at the same time, we're going to be talking a little bit tonight about schools that might require testing, where you don't necessarily have to report your scores until you get them. And maybe in some cases, like the ISEEs or the SSAT, some tests that Matt is going to be talking about, where you don't have to decide which set of scores to report until you take it once or even twice. So these little subtleties we're going to be talking about tonight. And again, I'm going to give you some more tangible examples in a second. So some require testing, some don't require testing. The vast majority of parochial schools, at least in New York City, do require some kind of test. Although what you're going to see for Catholic schools is that some schools may give you options in terms of what tests you take. So they might say you can take the TACHS exam, or you can take the ISEEs, or even the SSATs, and you can take the HSPT, and especially you might have to take it for a few schools in order to qualify for a scholarship. So what you're going to start to see is, and you might say to yourself, boy, there's actually some overlap between this school and that school in terms of the tests that they require, which can help you gain some efficiencies in terms of the number of tests that you're taking, which we'll talk more about in a few moments as well. Many students might take a test more than once, if a test allows you to do that in a single testing cycle. So for example, as Matt said, the SHSAT, you can only take it once in the 8th grade year. The TACHS exam, which a lot of the Catholic schools require, you can only take it once in a testing year. The HSPT, you can only take it once in a testing year. So as far as the ISEEs or the SSAT, however, and I know Matt's going to talk more about like, which one should I take, the ISEEs or the SSAT, if I'm applying to an independent school that accepts one versus the other. For those two tests in particular, there are a lot of students that end up taking that test more than once, and you can do that. And kind of the least common denominator in terms of schools that you might be applying to in terms of their testing, their timing requirements, is that usually what you'll see is that they require that you take the test, whether it's once or twice, you take it in the fall of 8th grade. So I'm going to turn it over back to Matt.
All right. Yeah. So the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about the SSAT, and then we're going to talk about the ISEE and how they are similar and different in there. So the next slide kind of nicely dovetails off what Maurice was saying. So the SSAT has the most options for testing. And when they were faced with the COVID and shutting down, their option was that they invented a at-home test, which is now several of these are done that way. And so a student can take 4 different testing options, and that can be take the at-home test, and that is offered most Saturdays and at least one Sunday per throughout the month, with obviously some exceptions of it, like not the Thanksgiving weekend and things like that. And the student can take, I believe, 3 times they can take the at home. They also can take one at the computer-based test at a Prometrics testing center, which is like where people go and take the GRE and a lot of grad school tests. And that would be where you walk in, it's like a quiet room with a computer. And then there's also these the flex and benchmark test. Benchmark is something that a school offers, so that would be for students already enrolled in an independent school. They might have set up a benchmark test. But the flex is interesting. It's where you schedule it with a provider and take it whenever you want. And then there is still a monthly paper-based test that's offered, one Saturday a month, starting in October and then going towards to February. And so the structure here is that it starts with the essay that's unscored. The reason it's unscored is that it is sent over to the admissions office, and so it's an opportunity for the admissions office to see like authentic writing, that no parent has proofread it. And I think it's kind of used as to see like if there was like an essay part of the application process, what's the difference between those. And I think they kind of informally use it as a psych eval to see is this kid, when given left to their own devices, did they write something, productive and appropriate. It's got 2 quantitative sections, reading comprehension. This also has verbal. So the SHSAT has no verbal section, but a lot of these other tests do. So the questions about whether you have to come up with a proper synonym, come up with an analogy. And then a experimental section that's unscored that they make the kids go through. But it's here. It's going to be, if you add this all up, it's over. It's almost 3 hours on there. So all these tests are kind of long. It's also the SSAT also has some of the more unique scoring. I would say that like kind of the SSAT is a very old-fashioned test. It is most similar to like an SAT you would have taken in the 80s or 90s. It does have a guessing penalty. So if a student answers incorrectly, they lose a quarter point off their raw score. And so one of the things of when I'm working with a student for SSAT is letting them know that this is part of the process, and that they answering efficiently, and if you don't know the word or you don't know the math concept, it's better to probably leave that blank. And a student who is, tries their best and is cavalier and just answers all the words and maybe they didn't even know what cavalier meant, they tend not to do as well. And here we're going to get into there's a scaled score, and the SSAT does have different levels. We're talking about high school admission, so that would be the upper level test. The upper level is what 8th graders take it in order to get into high school. There is a middle and even an elementary level, but that's a topic for a different day. And so it's from 500 to 800 per section, but they do offer a percentile. They had previously given percentile by grade and then also by gender. They have gotten rid of that, so it's just by grade. So they don't do separate kids by gender anymore. And so as I was saying, that it is an old school IQ test. I think it's the most old fashioned of any of these tests. And so it is a test that is just tricky by nature. Lots of trap answers. Math is not that challenging in terms of content, but it's definitely you're trying to find the most efficient way to do something, and I think that's a little bit different than what most students are experiencing in school. I would say that of all these tests, that the SSAT has the most advanced vocabulary and some of the more advanced passages on there. And so for a student who is less inclined to reading and doesn't like reading old texts, may find this test a little more challenging on there. And it's also important to kind of plan the schedule so that they can you can take the SSAT multiple times. I do see a scenario with students that I end up working with where they arrive to me in November, that they may have taken the November test without any prep because they were assuming that, my kid's smart and it has all A's and his teachers love him, and then take the test and their percentile is like in the 30s, and they're sort of like, what has happened? And the honest answer was that the student didn't know the test, and it was they don't teach this kind of like old school IQ thinking for valid reasons. And so it does make sense to put time and effort into this, and then also planning out that testing cycle, because I do have it where it's the late in the season, it's January, and a student's taking an at-home test and a paper test and then the flex test within a span of a week or two. just trying to, hope that that's, one or more of those gets the scores that they need. So like I'm trying to plan with that, I'm thinking about when you test, because there's the most options for that. I think next slide is going to be about the ISEE. Okay, so the ISEE is kind of the competitor to the SSAT nationwide. And the ISEE also offers some differences. So they do also have their own at-home test in there, and they also have the prometric test. And there are paper-based tests. Typically, ISEE is only given at affiliate schools, and that it's important that while a student can take the ISEE more than once, they can only test once in these testing windows. And so there's a fall window of August to November, and then at December 1, it goes into the winter window, which means they can test again. Now there is a spring summer window, and I don't know, I mean, maybe that's there for like students who are on wait lists or to get a certain kind of scholarship, but I've never had a student taken that in that third window. I think that's there really as sort of an exception, to at least give a unusual circumstances, it's just an unusual circumstances an option, but that's for families that are have eighth graders this fall. I would not plan for that, and to that end, a current seventh grader could not take the ISEE in hopes of getting this spring and then use it for admission for ninth grade. All the testing starts when the fall of eighth grade year. Just to make clear, I can see someone thinking, well, it's April right now, but that wouldn't work. The structure is similar to ISEE, but a little bit different. There's the verbal, the difference is that there's no analogies, but there's like sentence completions, which is something that was on the SAT back before 2015. Quantitative is math. Some of these they call quantitative comparisons, which is like on the GRE, which is like which value is bigger. Reading comprehension is pretty straightforward. One of the differences is the math achievement, and that is going to be where they're really pushing advanced concepts. So you'll see things that go all the way up to pre-calculus on the eighth grade test, and they're really trying to, that score is there to see how is your student beyond the grade level. And then there's an essay that is also unscored, just like the SSAT. Good news about the ISEE, there's no guessing penalty, so students should answer all questions. They offer the scaled score, and they use this very bizarre 760 to 940 range that doesn't match anything else in testing. And there is a percentile score, but there's also a Stanine score. And so a Stanine score goes from 1 to 9, and it's kind of, you should think of it as like a simplified percentile, but it's not it's not in groups of 10. If you like, the 9 is actually representing, I think, from 99th percentile to like 97th or 96th percentile. It's very, very narrow. And so a lot of schools, and we'll look at like the Stanine score, like, I don't know, to get, need 7 and above or something. I think it makes it more simple. So every student will receive all of those scores. And so for the strategy in there, because there are these 2 seasons, if you're applying to a school that uses ISEE scores, you definitely want to plan to test in the fall and have like a test done by November, and then also leave winter open, test in December or January. And certainly don't wait till December, because you're giving up one of those opportunities to test. To kind of compare SSAT to ISEE and to SHSAT, I would say that the ISEE's verbal and reading sections are pretty easy. The passages they're straightforward, and it's a lot of questions like, what is the main idea? What does this paragraph do? They're not too challenging, but the math is definitely harder. It is the most math concepts in there. And if we think about for high school or for college admissions, SAT and ACT, the SSAT is more like the SAT, which is more heavy on verbal, and then the ISEE is more like the ACT, which is the way that it delineates the top end of the scales by testing more math concepts.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. So here's where things tend to get really interesting. And I think that big picture, one of the things that one of the ideas we always preach is this idea of casting the widest net possible. So you sort of look at applying to high school in New York City as both, kind of a double-edged sword where you've got this huge opportunity. You've got so many schools you can apply to and a lot of choice, much more so than where I grew up, for example, where I just went to my neighborhood school. So that's great. But on the other hand, it then becomes incumbent upon the family to do their research and do their homework. And there can be, depending upon the number of schools you're applying to and the different types of schools you're applying to, can be a lot of work. So you start to think to yourself, number one, how do I balance that? Like, how do I cast the widest net possible so that when all is said and done, by the spring of 8th grade, I have as many options as I possibly can. Now, I think, everybody would probably agree that's a good place to be. The 8th grade families that I'm working with right now, for example, that have these options where they haven't put all their eggs in one basket, that's a really nice place to be. But on the other hand, then it raises questions in terms of how much time and effort am I willing to put into this? How much time and effort is my child willing to put into this? And are there efficiencies that we can gain? So I was thinking about these next couple slides in terms of how I can really get to the essence of gaining efficiencies with all the different testing. And Matt's going to talk a little bit more about a couple of different tests later on, but there are, I think, 4 or 5 different categories of considerations when it comes to gaining efficiency when you find yourself with schools that require different tests. One is from a timing perspective, as Matt started to talk about. So looking at your fall schedule sort of strategically to a certain degree so that you're not taking all your tests in a really, really condensed period of time. So that's number one. And generally speaking, as Matt mentioned, with something like the ISEEs or the SSAT, compared to the other tests that we've talked about tonight, there's a lot more flexibility in terms of when you take your tests and how many times you take your tests. When it comes to the SHSAT, you pretty much know you're going to take it probably the end of October. When it comes to the HSPT, which is another test Matt's going to be talking about, you pretty much know you might have a couple different options in terms of test dates, but you're pretty much going to, you can take it once and you're going to take it in like mid-November. With a TACHS exam, you can only take it once and you're going to take it usually the first week of November. So you start to look at these things kind of strategically from a timing perspective. So timing is number one. The second way that I like to look at it is in terms of preparing for the test. I mean, working with an expert like Matt, and Applerouth, they can help you, understand what efficiencies you can gain by preparing for multiple tests at one time. How is preparing for one test going to help you with another test? So that's number two. Number three is, I want to pay attention if I'm applying to a bunch of different schools, if I'm multiple Myron and I'm applying to a bunch of different schools, are there schools that give merit scholarships, presumably parochial schools or boarding schools in some cases? And if so, do they have particular requirements for scholarship eligibility? There are 3 or so parochial schools in New York City that will only consider you for a merit scholarship if you take the HSPT, for example. And I'm talking about schools like Fordham Prep, Xavier, Regis. They will give you options in terms of tests that you can take, but P.S., if you want to be considered for a scholarship, you got to take the HSPT. So that's another consideration. The next consideration is the number of schools that I can apply to. I mean, this kind of falls into the category of, casting the widest net. If I'm applying to the TACHS exam, for example, and actually let's go to the next slide if you don't mind, Ginger. If I'm a student that is, let's say, family 3, and I'm applying to parochial schools, and some of those parochial schools or Catholic schools allow me to take something other than the TACHS exam. If they say, if I'm applying to a school like, let's go back to Fordham Prep or Loyola or Marymount or Xavier or Sacred Heart, these parochial schools in New York City that say, you know what, you don't have to take necessarily the TACHS exam to be considered for our school. You can take something else like the ISEE. So not only can that be important in terms of gaining efficiency with your preparation and the number of tests you're taking, but you know what? It can also potentially help you increase the number of schools that you're applying to. And the reason why I say that is because if I'm taking the TACHS exam, and this is different from the ISEEs and the SSAT, if I'm taking the TACHS exam, I can only list up to 3 Catholic schools when I take the TACHS exam. There's a limit. But if I'm applying to a parochial school that allows me to take another test, guess what? I can apply to 3 schools that require the TACHS exam. And then I can, on top of that, also apply to some other Catholic schools that accept some other exams. So I want to think about it in those terms as well. The number of schools that I can apply to, because then guess what? My net can be that much wider. And then finally, and this is more Matt's area of expertise, but how many tests do I want to take? Just in terms of the sheer number of tests you're taking and the number, the content that you need to focus on and test taking strategies and so forth and so on, I may not want to take 4 or 5 different tests. So whether you might fall into the category of family 1, family 2, family 3, and especially family 3, that's a family that's applying to a lot of schools. That's a lot of work, right? I mean, if I'm applying to independent schools in particular, if I'm family 2 or family 3, applying to independent schools is a lot of work. Between the essays and the interviews and the applications and the questionnaires and, and potentially test taking, it's a lot of work. So, when you're considering the number of tests that you're taking on top of that, it can be a really important consideration. And I come across a lot of families that come to me and say, like, Maurice, we're applying to a lot of schools, but you know what? We'd rather apply to some test optional schools because we know that might mean 1 less test to worry about. So there are a lot of different, I think there are 5 of these different categories that I just rattled off in terms of gaining efficiencies and thinking a little bit strategically. And I know I'm preaching to the choir because a lot of you were probably on the session tonight you're getting an early head start and you're starting to plan nice and early, and that's great because you can be more strategic about this. And unfortunately, there are plenty of families that don't do that. And they're not the ones that are here tonight or listening to the recording. They're the ones that are getting started later on in the process. So I'm going to, at this point, turn it back over to Matt.
Yeah, a couple to those points. One, I can't imagine why someone wouldn't want to take as many tests as possible. But that's, tests are my sport. But that just sounds weird. But also, yeah, having done this a lot, do go. Where I applaud all the families that came or say on thinking of, in April about this, because I do see a lot of families panicked, and for the SHSAT it's in October and the test is in 2 or 3 weeks, and now they're thinking about it, or for the SSAT they've already taken it once and didn't go well, and now they're scrambling, and now suddenly winter break is nothing but SSAT tutoring, every day but Christmas or something is the sort of the some of the scenarios I've seen in the past. So we talked about the 2 tests for the program schools. So we have the high school placement test used from some Catholic schools, and it is given by affiliated schools for 8th graders usually in December or January. So it is one of the later tests in there. There is like the percentiles for the kind of these are the ones that most are concerned of as cognitive skills, which they're putting in verbal and quantitative in there. Then basic skills, reading, mathematics, and language, and that's also all the 5 different categories of it, and then obviously a composite of those percentiles. I could talk a lot about HSPT because it is a wild test in the sense that it has the most diverse question types, and you have the least amount of time to do it. But that means that it's not that difficult, but in the sense of like no question is that hard. But like on the verbal section, you have there are 60 questions. You have 16 minutes to complete them all. But they were like questions like, what is the opposite, or which word doesn't belong? And so, and they're not organized. So you're kind of bouncing, and some of them are just like straight up logic, and you're bouncing topics. And so there's definitely like some exposure to that test is really helpful. But I would say that like none of the the math or the quantitative, it's not as challenging as the ISEE or the SSAT or SHSAT. It's an odd test. It's the only test that has like spelling and stuff on it, which word is misspelled. And it is like, the main thing is managing time, because if we're a slow test taker, this one is really brutal. It's just like, it's like buckshot testing. It's just like how many different things can you do at once in a very short amount of time. All right, then we got the TACHS. So as I wrote the slides, the test for admission to Catholic high school does what the name says. It is the most straightforward of these acronyms. So it is, as of now, it is administered at home. So we have like the SSAT, the ISEE, and the TACHS are all possible at-home tests. We're taking on a platform there. It offers you get a local and national percentage rank, which is kind of interesting. Of like, I don't know how much of the national is like an estimate of it, because obviously not that many students are taking this test in the greater sense of things. Because none of these have like, if you go to nationwide, right? Most students are not. They're just going to the high school in their district. So it is reading, written expression, and mathematics, and you get a percentile for that. I would say that this, all in all, this is the least taxing test. Pun entirely intentional. That it's as all it is the questions are pretty straightforward. The math does not extend beyond what an eighth grader could do. The reading passages makes sense. It's normal grammar. I think a lot of students who take this test, they're not doing 20 hours of tutoring for it. Like it's something where I think that a lot of students, a lot of families are kind of like, okay, you can take this, it matches school enough. I would, the HSPT is way different, and that I think that one's really weird. But TACHS isn't. It's for students that are have some experience with any kind of standardized testing, with Iowa tests or the Regents tests. It's fairly equivalent.
Thanks, Matt. And by the way, on that note, I would mention that I come across families with students who take the TACHS exam that have not put in a tremendous amount of effort and are pleasantly surprised that they did well enough to even get a scholarship. And these Catholic schools, with one exception, you don't have to be Catholic. So, I find more and more families are considering Catholic schools in New York City as another alternative. So in any case, I'll give my little 30-second public service announcement. So my team, very different from the work that Applerouth does. We don't do tutoring and test prep, but we work with families on helping them navigate the admissions process. So everything from choosing schools to helping with essays and interview prep, and helping you understand how the DOE works and how that application works and everything in between. So the only thing we don't help families with is the kinds of things that Applerouth does. If you're interested, we're happy to have an introductory complimentary phone call with you just to discuss how we might be able to help you and your family. And I would just mention that also that we work with families on everything from pre-K admissions, which I went through with my little girl, all the way up through the college admissions process. So if, at any age group, we're happy to talk to you about how we can help you make the admissions process a little bit easier, and take more control over it, and ideally give you a better outcome. And I think I'm turning it back over to Matt or Ginger.
Thank you, Maurice. I think it would be a good toss-up question, which is harder to get into these days, college or pre-K. Um, they're both challenging for every member of the family in different ways. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. As Matt mentioned, we have a free SHSAT practice test coming up in a couple of weeks. That's a great opportunity for students to get a little bit of practice and experience, try and sort of flex that testing muscle and see how you want to work it through this process. So we'd be delighted if you'd like to join us for that. If you are interested in private tutoring for any of the tests that we talked about tonight, those are things that we at Applerouth would be delighted to be able to help you with. So please let us know if we can be of help to you. So that's enough from us. Now it's time for your questions, and we have a lot of them. So we're going to try and cover as many topics as we can in the time that we have tonight. One question that I know folks wanted to start with is, how do I know if I should submit my scores or not? So Maurice, you mentioned that there are some schools that are test optional. At Applerouth, we usually say submission optional, right? Because you want to take the test and see where your scores stand to see if that's something that could be of help to you in any of the processes that you're part of. So how do you know whether or not you should submit your test scores along with your application at schools where it is test optional?
It's a great question, and it is a challenge for families, and that's not to sound like I'm patting ourselves on the back, but that's where we come in, or a school counselor or somebody that whoever you're working with, because ultimately it's going to depend on the school, and it probably is also going to depend on all the other components of your application and how strong they are and the kind of candidate you are for that particular school. So there are a lot of variables involved. There's no one size fits all. And if I said to you that, well, if you achieve the such and such a score, you should submit it, I'd be doing you a disservice if I made a blanket statement like that.
Thanks, Maurice. I think that's really true. For so much of these processes, the answer is it depends, right? And it does depend on students' particular circumstances. And it's great if they can reach out to you to get your team's insight on that. How many schools should a family be applying to? And is it a good idea to look at lots of different kinds of schools, or is it better to narrow your focus?
At this time of year, what I find myself preaching a lot is to avoid narrowing much of anything at all, because we've got time. Now, there is, on the other hand, there is something to be said for, taking on too much, especially depending upon the child's psyche and where they are in their heads and how willing and motivated they are to consider certain types of schools, because there are some kids that, for example, are dead set against applying to a particular kind of school for whatever reason. That said, you want to cast the widest net possible. I mean, I like it when families are at this time of year thinking kind of generally in the back of their heads, they're thinking, you know what, I'm going to apply to maybe 2 or 3 different types of schools. And that's kind of a nice rule of thumb, I suppose. But again, to your point, Ginger, it also depends on the student and their qualifications and what kind of candidate they can be for particular schools. Because, if one of your categories are the SHSAT schools, but your child, for whatever reason, doesn't test well, that's not just how they demonstrate their, the kind of student they are, then that, that's may not be a viable option. So it also depends on the type of test and the student itself. But that's another thing. Whatever counselor you're working with can help you determine the optimal number of types of schools that you should be applying to. The last thing I'll just say on that matter is that, there are rules of thumb. I mean, for the main public application in New York City, you should put down 12 choices you're willing to consider on that application. And that's a whole other conversation. You'll hear people say for independent schools, well, you should be applying to anywhere from like 6 to 10 schools. But it really does depend on the individual family circumstances and what your family's goals are.
Thanks, Maurice. Matt, a question for you. When is the right time to start prepping?
I think that depending on which test, like, right, because if you have something with the like the SHSAT has that one test day that is, you know, depending on the whims of the New York City Board of Education, could be like could be mid-October, might be early November. But that's going to give you a pretty narrow window where I would think that, you know, over the summer and using that time to cover math concepts, to get more exposure to reading, and then, you know, to be prepped, it, you know, makes the most sense. For a, you know, SSAT or something like that, you could test well into December or January, and so like there maybe, you know, if it makes sense with the student's schedule and the sports they play and all the other things, you know, like anywhere from you know, August to September start can work pretty well.
Thank you. A question, one of my son's teachers shared that students won't have learned some of the math that's on the SHSAT until next spring after the test. Is that true? And what is a student to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible depending on the math lane of the student, right? There, I think, you know, they have reorganized this test, I think, to try to make it like reflect what an eighth grader should be having in there. But I think there's, you know, there's enough variance in different, you know, in different schools and different teacher styles, that, so I guess it would be of trying to quantify that, like what has the student done, and then, you know, recognizing that, you know, if it's Stuyvesant or bust, then maybe, you know, like it's worth putting the effort into gain those skills, right, through outside study, through, you know, through Khan Academy, through, like, you know, other educational resources, and not have the kind of, I think that some families have an assumption that like a student can't learn something until their teacher teaches it. And I see that in these tests, you know, oftentimes I have to push a student further. Okay, we haven't seen this before, but we can get there together, and think of it, you know, that way, because, you know, it's worth putting that extra effort in for the outcome, especially on the SSAT.
Thanks, Matt. I would agree with that. I think that also speaks to building students' confidence, right? If they've seen the question before, they at least know, oh, I don't know how to do that yet, so this is one I should skip if it's a test that penalizes me for guessing, or this is one where I am just going to have to guess if I have a 25% chance of guessing right, and that sort of thing. I would also just say that there are a lot of students who are in middle school right now who experienced learning loss during the pandemic. And I think we've seen that the most in math for students kind of across the board, that there were just some concepts that they didn't get to, they didn't learn as well as they should, and it's a little Jenga game, and there's a hole somewhere in there, and when you put pressure on the top, the whole thing starts to fall apart. And so sometimes tutoring can be really effective for shoring up those skills for school, where the student can build confidence and their grades can improve, as well as benefiting them when it comes around to standardized testing. So that may also be part of the reason why, you know, some students are on a slightly different schedule, is that their teachers are acknowledging that they are catching up a little bit from some concepts that they didn't have as strong a background on because of the time that they were learning from home. Okay. Oh, a rumor. I love rumors that we can confirm or deny. On the ISEE, the ISEE, which we call the ISEE, on the ISEE, does the timing when you take it influence the weighting? There's a rumor that if you take it in September, you might have a more favorable ranking than if you take it in December or January. Any truth to this rumor?
Probably not. I think that any of the kind of that game of like, oh, if you test here, you'll do better, is, I mean, it's anecdotal at best. You know, they're essentially all the kids are taking the same test in that, like, in the testing window, right? And they should be normed against this, so that like a test like that I see, like, it should be like any administration should give you like a fair like a fair equivalency. And there are people who are like, you know, have PhDs in psychometrics and stuff that are like, or keep, you know, they're doing the math to keep that the case. But I think, you know, it's kind of it's a rumor, but it's also kind of superstitious, and it's also like if you believe it may also be more effective in the sense, you know, of like, do you feel good about that choice? But I think, you know, you know, whatever makes sense for the student, and I think testing in the two windows. But I can't imagine that you would do it better on a percentage or percentile if you tested earlier in the cycle versus later in the cycle, because it's getting normed into like a very large grouping of students.
Thanks, Matt. A question about a student who is a non-native speaker of English. So an English language learner who's early in their middle school career, who is hoping to apply to a specialized high school in New York City. Generally speaking, Maurice, what advice would you give to that student? What should they be doing in the next couple of years in order to get ready for that application process?
Well, I think whether it's an English language learner or not, I don't recommend starting to think about any of this in 6th grade. I think a good time to start thinking about this for all families is sometime in 7th grade, you know, probably by mid 7th grade. And I think you know, in terms of spring of 7th grade, let's say, I think one good piece of advice for this family would be to start doing your homework and getting a better sense of the school landscape, because there are a lot of programs, I mean, in terms of public school programs that are definitely geared towards students who are English language learners, and some really good programs. And I think it's good to start to identify them and determine which ones are the best fit for your child in the 7th grade year. So again, you're not behind the 8 ball in the 8th grade year, but that's kind of consistent with what I would say for a lot of different kinds of programs. It's not very much different advice that I would give. It just so happens that arguably those programs might be a little bit harder to find and are not as well known as some of the brand name schools and programs that everybody talks about.
Thanks.
I do have one follow-up comment on there. For English language learners, if they're documented as such in their school, that is considered an accommodation. And on the SHSAT, a student can get extended time and can get a glossary dictionary for their native language to English, which could be, you know, be a really great asset when, you know, when taking that test. And they can use it throughout, so it wouldn't just be for the ELA portion. They can also use it in the math for word problems or something. And so making sure that now making sure those accommodations are set up so that when it's time to take that in the 8th grade year, like that's one less stress that student would have to go through.
Thanks, Matt. That's a really great tip. I'm so glad you mentioned it. I'm remembering that I had a student who was from Myanmar, and she did have an English language learner accommodation on her standardized testing, but I had a really hard time finding a Karen to English dictionary, which is her dialect. So sometimes it may be a struggle, but for a lot of students, that can be a fantastic resource and a really great opportunity to have a little bit of extra time while you're taking the test in order to look up those unfamiliar words. So thank you for sharing that tip.
Can I just, I'm sorry, can I just chime in one more note? You know, I think it is unfortunate that families where English is not their first language can absolutely be at a disadvantage when it comes to applying to high schools in New York City. So the only other thing that I wanted to add to that is to get to know your counselor as early as possible, despite what I said before about not even thinking about this in 6th grade. Get to know your counselor at your school, get to know, you know, make sure they understand your family's particular circumstances, because as much as I hate to say it, there are added complexities when you're going through this process, when you're a student who's either a student with disability or a student where English is not your first language.
Thanks, Maurice. I wanted to wrap up with a last question that was actually the first question that was submitted, but I wanted to save it to the end. And this student is wondering, how should I find out like where I should go, right? Well, how would I know what high school is a good fit for me? What resources should I be looking for? Should I ask people in my life, like teachers, my counselor, like you were just talking about, Maurice? Are there resources that are out there that can help me get to know some of these schools? So Matt, if you've heard from your students about some resources that have been helpful for them in their search, and Maurice, if you have, one or two resources that you would suggest for a student who's just trying to figure out if, how would I learn about these schools if I'm going to go to high school any place other than the one I can walk to from my house?
I'll let Matt go first.
Oh, I was letting you. I mean, because I think that a lot of what I do is, okay, that decision's maybe already been made, and now I come in to okay, we need to get the SSAT percentile up, or we want to go to Stuyvesant, and like we're trying to do the best on the SHSAT. So I think Maurice has much more experience in that regard.
I mean, I would say definitely number one, get to know your counselor first and foremost. And number two, depending upon the types of school, public, private, parochial, et cetera, there are good resources to start with. So for public schools, for example, InsideSchools.org is a great resource to start building your list and looking at schools. The My School system, myschools.nyc. For parochial schools, the TACHS website, taxinfo.com. The Parents League for independent schools is a great resource. So because especially this time of year in 7th grade, there are events that are going on right now, besides our event, there are other events that are going on just for that purpose. And you can find them through these organizations and these search websites, so that you don't leave everything until the fall. But if I'm looking at public high schools, and I haven't been able to actually go to any schools yet because many of the formal events aren't until the fall of 8th grade, unfortunately, I'm going to go to the school's websites because there are a lot of recorded events. And I'm also going to go to Inside Schools. And you know what? If I'm really motivated and engaged and want to get a head start, I'm going to visit some schools in the fall. Like if I'm interested in maybe an audition program, guess what? I'm going to go see a performance at LaGuardia. I'm going to go see a performance at Frank Sinatra High School. So there are plenty of events that are open to the public besides the recordings on the websites that I can also take advantage of even before the formal admissions event starts. And one more thing, sorry, I'm blabbing. A lot of the independent schools have events coming up over the next couple months. Take advantage of that. Even if it's a school that, I'm doing this too. Even if it's a school that you're not sure you're going to apply to, that's okay. That's the purpose of these events, is just to get a better sense of the landscape. But the independent schools, unlike the public schools, a lot of them are having formal admissions events now. I mean, I just went to a virtual event yesterday for an independent school. It's like an easy way to start to get a sense of the landscape. Now I'll be quiet.
I think those are all great tips, Maurice, and it is definitely spring is musical season. And I think you can see a great show at LaGuardia, whether or not you even wind up in that applicant process, you might just have a great evening. And that's such a great way to begin, to go to a sporting event or to go to an arts event and see your people. Are your people here, right? Do those students feel like the kinds of kids you want to go to school with and you want your child to go with and grow with? So that's a great way to lurk and learn. And I will say, for those of you who tuned in tonight, this was a great start. This was a great way for you to start your process and open your eyes and start thinking about the possibilities. I think it's just so exciting for students to know that they have choices throughout this process. You are not a passive person. You are engaging with this process and engaging with your education and asking a lot of it. And it's going to give some great things to you. So thank you all so much for tuning in tonight. Matt and Maurice, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. I always learn something when I'm talking with you all, and that certainly happened tonight. If we can be of help to you at Applerouth, or if Maurice can be of help for you in the application process, I hope you'll reach out to us. You will get a copy of this recording and presentation as a thanks for everyone who registered tonight. So feel free to share it if you have family members or friends who weren't able to join us live, and we'll be glad to answer your questions along the way. We wish you the very best of luck in the adventures ahead, and we thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.